Hello guys, welcome back to another video. In this video and in my upcoming videos, I'll be basically continuing my series on design patterns. And today we're going to be taking a look at singleton design pattern and essentially what are the use cases of singleton design pattern and why is it so popular in the software development industry nowadays. I mean, it has become a de facto for a developer to know or be familiar with this pattern. I mean, it is used everywhere. You can literally find the use cases of this pattern in almost all parts of your daily software development. I mean, if you have been consuming libraries, if you have been implementing some backend, you must have gone through this pattern. You must have heard about this pattern or this terminology at least once in your career. So today we're going to be taking a look at how this pattern works and how we can actually implement this pattern in TypeScript. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. All right, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to actually think of an example where the singleton pattern can be applicable, right? So let's take an example. Let's take a scenario where we want to create an instance. We want to create a database connection, um, and this database connection, of course, needs to be only created once throughout the life cycle of your application, right? So this is one of the most known and one of the most applicable scenarios when it comes to using singleton design pattern. So that's exactly why we will be taking a look at this example. Okay, so we want to make sure that only a single instance of this database connection is established. How can we do this? How can we design a class that restricts the creation of multiple instances of itself? How can we do that? That's the first question. That's the big question. So let's start designing such a class, right? So we're going to quickly grab our class diagram here. And as you can see, I'm going to call this database connection. That's the first thing that we need to do. And secondly, what we really need to do is we need to create something called a private constructor. So I'm just going to call this database connection, and this is a private constructor. Okay, now this changes a lot of things. We have essentially turned our constructor into private, which means that this access modifier is not going to let us create new instances of this class at all. How do we make sure, how do we even create an instance of this class in the first place? That's the big question. Okay, so the second thing that we need to do is, of course, that's a mistake. I have to move this method below right here, and yeah, okay, that's a problem. Yeah, that's better. And we also need to create a variable, and we're going to call this variable instance. Okay, so this instance is essentially corresponding to the same database connection class instance, and we have essentially stored our private instance. So now we know that only we inside this class can access this instance, and any other consumer class or a client class cannot actually access this instance directly. Now, how can we access this instance? How can we access this instance? Well, the only way we can think of really, how to really basically allow another class to get the instance is to create a public method, essentially. So that public method can actually take this instance and return it. So the last part of the singleton pattern is a method, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and add a new method, and I'm going to call, now this method right here is going to be a public method, right? So this is going to be get instance, and this is essentially what's going to return our database connection to us. Okay, let's think about this for a second and see what have we done exactly. So this is exactly it. There's nothing more to be actually understood in the singleton design pattern. This is the whole pattern, and now we need to understand how this works. So now, if I think about, let's suppose, a client, and if the client wants to create an instance of this database connection, it has to do it using this class that we have created. So what I have to do is I'm just going to go ahead and connect an arrow, and I'm pointing this arrow to the same get instance method. So the client can only access this method right here. The client cannot access the instance, this private instance. The client cannot access the database connection constructor, and the only thing that we can access is the get instance. So if we think about the logic, we know that all of our logic is going to go inside this get instance method, where we need to decide that if we already have an instance created, we need to return the same instance. All right. So how do we do that? Well, Let's just pop over. Let's just go into our editor and implement this using TypeScript so that it makes more sense. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to call this class database connection. All right, and oops, yeah, there we go. And what we need to do is we need to make our constructor private, which means now we cannot create new instances of this class. So if I just say dbcon right here and say new database connection, you can see that it's an error because we cannot access this um, this method right here, this constructor method right here, because it has been set to private, right? So how do we make sure that that an instance is returned? Well, we need to first of all create a new private um, instance, and we need to store this instance inside this variable, inside this private variable. And I have to make sure the type of this variable is database connections, because we will be using this, we will be storing the instance of the same class. And then finally we're going to create a method. This method right here is going to be called getInstance, so that it makes more sense. You know, the sense essentially the purpose of this method should be clear to us, and that's why I've named this getInstance. And now what do we need to do? We need to check if this dot instance is equal to null, right? So I'm basically strict type checking this and seeing that if an instance has already been created, then what do we need to do? We need to, if the instance has already not been created, then we need to create an instance. So I'm going to say this dot instance equals to new database connection. Okay, what have we done here? Now let's just think about this for a second. We are accessing the constructor within the class of database connection. So although this constructor is private, it is still accessible within the class itself. Of course, that makes sense. But now we are able to create an instance, and we're also able to check, well, if the instance is already not created, then we're creating an instance. Otherwise, we will just return this dot instance. Okay, now once we have done this, we need to basically call this. Now the big question is, how do we call this method if you're not able to create a new instance of this class in the first place? Well, we know from our object-oriented programming knowledge that we can just use a static keyword method, and this is going to allow us to basically call this method directly instead of creating an instance. Okay, so I'm just going to do that, and I'm just going to call get instance, and just like that we have created an instance. But here, wait a second, what are we getting? So it says that we are trying to access this instance variable, which is part of the database connection class, right? So we need to also make sure that this instance now is also a static variable, right? Because we want to access this variable directly, because we'll be accessing the method get instance directly outside this class. So everything that is included inside this class also needs to be static. So we're just going to now say database connection dot instance, and so we're also going to say database connection dot instance, right? And finally database connection dot instance. Perfect. And just like that, we have now created and implemented our singleton design pattern. And this actually is pretty simple, but as you can see, the goal of this is actually to prevent multiple instances, and we are just achieving that using just a very few lines of code. And you can think of so many scenarios where you might want to implement the same pattern. So essentially this is why I have used TypeScript, so that you can actually go ahead and replicate this in maybe Node.js or Angular or React if you have been working with applications. So you must have actually came to the similar scenario at least once in the past. So now you know. Okay, so without any delay, I'm going to just go ahead and end this video right here. I hope that this video helped you understand the singleton design pattern. I'll be coming up with another video in which I'll be covering another creational design pattern. Until then, uh, bye.